All right, so we talked last week about the fact that there is an AMD launch of the 5600X3D that's exclusive to Micro Center only, which means 99.9% of the world will never have a chance to own one. But that means we went ahead and tested it anyway. And you know what? It's kind of surprising the crap out of us.
We interrupt this video to bring you a special message from iFixit. No, we interrupt this interruption with this interruption about new stuff from iFixit. Wish you had a new graphics card, but inventory sucks? Fix the inventory problems with iFixit. Whoa, don't drop it. Can't fix that with iFixit. Just kidding, yes you can. Wish you could take iFixit with you anywhere, but your pockets aren't big enough? Introducing the new More
and the new Minnow.
Take them with you anywhere. So get iFixit for your loved ones, or just get them for yourself.
So in the announcement video, we talked about the specs and whatnot. So we'll just kind of do a quick high-level recap of the specs. It's a 5600X3D built on the exact same process as a 5800X3D. The difference is it has 2 less cores and 4 less threads, 3 megabyte L2 cache, 96 megabyte L3 cache compared to the 32 megabyte L2 cache or L3 cache found on the non-X3D variant or the 5600X. So it's up to 4.4 gigahertz on the boost frequency, and it's 100 megahertz lower than the 5800X3D. They have limited overclocking support because the V-cache, as we know, is extremely sensitive to voltage and temperatures, even though it is a 105 watt part versus the 65 watt part of a 5600X. Now, when it comes to reviewing this CPU, it was interesting because we've moved along from AM4 rather quickly over the last year or so with all the AM5 CPUs and the new X3D CPUs that have made their way to AM5. Of course, I'm talking about the 7800X3D. Remember the one that some motherboard manufacturers were overvolting and causing to explode both the motherboard and the CPU, literally explode. The 7900X3D and 7950X3D. And I've been running the 7950X3D in my personal rig ever since it came out, and so far, no problems, and I haven't tuned any of the voltage and stuff, which makes things interesting, the fact that AMD has basically come out with a limited run of a CPU based off the 5800X3D and AM4. Now, the major differences between the two platforms, obviously, is going to be AM5 and Zen 4 architecture on the 7000 series CPUs, and then obviously Zen 3 architecture that exists on the 5000 series CPU or the 5600X3D. Now, in this testing, I had wanted to do a pretty wide range of CPUs because here's the thing, the CPU costs $229. That's a pretty uniform price because they're only available at Micro Center. And one of the reasons for that is since this is such a limited run of CPUs that was basically a reusing of the 5800X3D process to basically kind of recycle silicon that the company was kind of collecting and not sure what to do with, is why they came out with a lower tiered part of the X3D variant. They don't have a lot of them, which is why they only paired up with one retailer. And I'm not even saying e-tailer because you cannot buy CPU bundles or CPUs, motherboards, and GPUs online at Micro Center for shipping. You can buy online for in-store pickup, but you cannot have it shipped to your location. So unless you live within driving distance or you're willing to take a trip to one, it's gonna be very difficult for you to get your hands on. Anyway, with that said, at that $229 price point there, and we talked about this on the RTFM show on Friday, there's quite a boost in price for that X3D. For instance, the 5600X non-3D costs $148 at Amazon. And I'm not even using Micro Center's pricing because finding an alternative, if you can't get to Micro Center, is gonna be the pricing you're subject to, whether it be on Amazon, Newegg, Best Buy, whatever. So $148 was the price for the 5600X on Best Buy. I really wanted to test this with a 5600 or 5700X or a 5800X, which cost $189 and $208 respectively. So even $208 for a 5800X non-3D is $20 or $21 less than what it would cost at Micro Center. And that's a pretty decent chunk of change, like 20 bucks still can go towards half your RAM, because we already talked about the fact that DDR4, 16 gigabytes of DDR4 Team Group 3200 megahertz is 30 bucks. So you add $10 to that, there's your RAM, by just going with a higher end CPU in terms of core count and clock speed, but giving up the V-cache, which is all about gaming performance. So realistically, this CPU is targeted towards gamers that want to get as much FPS out of their GPU as possible. However, unless you're finding yourself with a high enough end GPU to actually bottleneck the CPU, you're not gonna see any benefit to the V-cache. So that's one of the things that we were looking for here, and that's why we tested it with an RTX 4090. A pairing that I would think makes no sense whatsoever, because the RTX 4090 can cost up to 10 times more than the CPU. Even if you get it for MSRP at around $1,500-$1,600 for the Founders Edition, that is a $229 CPU paired with a $1,600+ GPU is just a terrible, terrible thing. But in our testing, what we're looking for here is not the best pairing. That would be a different type of video. This is what happens if we just throw a lot of GPU at it and compare it with the different CPUs to see what the bottlenecks look like in the comparative CPUs. So although I would love to have compared it with a 5700 or 5800X, apparently I don't have any. I know for a fact I did. I can't seem to find them, and I cannot get them here in time for this review to make it out on embargo day, which is a day before they go on sale, which is important for you guys to be able to have this information prior to them going on sale so you determine if a 3-hour trip to Micro Center is even worth your time for this CPU. With that said, I compared it to a Ryzen 5 7600 non-X. And the reason why I did that is you can get that CPU for $219. However, the caveat with that is you obviously have to adopt DDR5, which is a bit more expensive. So both of our systems are actually running G-Skill Trident memory. One's DDR4 Neo, specifically for AMD, and then the DDR5 is running the Expo RAM, also designed for AMD. And both are running 32 gigabytes of RAM. Now, you can get 32 gigabytes of Team Group for $80 versus 32 gigabytes of Team Group DDR4 for $48. So you can see there's more cost, obviously, with going with the DDR5 platform. Now, that is basically where like the similarities kind of end, because we're talking forward compatibility and forward upgradability on AM5 unless you go with like a 5800X3D, if you still want the V3D cache. That's the only other CPU you could upgrade to in terms of gaming on the AM4 platform, unless you're just gonna go with like a 5950X or something like that for ultimate productivity and still decent gaming performance. We really didn't know what to expect with this CPU, and Phil and I both tag teamed this testing as he was testing on the 5600X3D while I was simultaneously testing the 7600, and then we took the exact same GPU off one system and plopped it on the other, so there were no variance in GPU performance at all. Same exact GPU on these two different platforms. So the AM4 platform is running an X570 Aorus Extreme motherboard, which is extremely overpriced for this type of setup. We would highly recommend like a B550 or something like that for this CPU, because overclocking is not something you can even really do. It's very limited. There'd be no reason to pair it with an expensive overclocking board, but I chose it because it's not Asus. And then the AM5 platform is actually running the X570X Extreme Tai Chi ASRock motherboard. So let's go ahead and start talking about our results, shall we? When it comes to CPU, we did a test methodology here of some synthetic CPU benchmarks as well as GPU benchmarks, because although it is definitely aimed at gaming, you have to see what the trade-off is gonna be between the two different types of CPUs to be able to say whether or not giving up productivity is worth the improvement in gaming. And again, we are looking for bottlenecks. We intentionally are throwing a big GPU at it. Obviously, as the GPU comes down the stack into a more mid-range or lower high-end range and not a 4090, you would see these gaps probably be even less. Okay, let's talk performance numbers, because ultimately that's what matters. The 5600X3D, and I wanna point something out here. You have to update the BIOS for your motherboard. If you're running any sort of old BIOS. If you're running a BIOS that came out prior to the 5800X3D, then it won't accurately know what to do with a 5600X3D. And this is true no matter what, like any newer CPU that's also come out, because it updates the motherboard to know what the heck it's dealing with. So initially we ran our numbers with just the BIOS that launched with the Aorus, because initially we were told like, yeah, you don't really need to do anything with your motherboard. But that's only half truth. You have to update it to whatever, at least 5800X3D or newer to be able to deal with this. Because what we noticed and we observed was that the numbers were really low because the clocks were not boosting. They were just staying at their base clock of about 3.4 gigahertz. So initially our numbers were extremely low. And to be honest, we won't even go through what those numbers are because they're completely irrelevant, but it's just observed behavior Update your BIOS. It's extremely important to at least something beyond a 5800X3D support and compatibility. Moving on, when we look at the post-BIOS numbers, our multi-core got us a 9401. Now that's versus the 7600's 12,112. Now this makes perfect sense because the 7600 boosts to over 5 gigahertz in single core and about 5.9 or 4.9 gigahertz in all core. And because of the fact that it's got newer architecture and higher clock speed, you would expect the numbers to be higher. Moving on, Cinebench R23.2, multi-core performance. We got a 10,799 with the 5600X3D versus a 14,339 for the 7600. So obviously you can see the benefits to the newer Ryzen architecture and the newer platform and DDR5. Although Cinebench doesn't really use RAM that much. So moving on now to TimeSpy Extreme 5600X3D. Got a, I should just start calling 5600 3D, it'd be easier to say, but whatever. 4,032 versus the 7600's 4662. So a little bit closer, but still 600 points or well over 10% difference in terms of score there. Now the last CPU specific test that we did was a Blender benchmark. Now that has 3 tests it runs within it: Monster, Junk Shop, and Classroom. It's basically kind of like what Cinebench does with path tracing and stuff to draw the image. The 5600X3D in Monster got a 75.8 samples per minute versus the 7600's 96.6. So you can see in terms of computational tasks, it cannot come close to a cheaper CPU on a newer platform. Junk Shop, it's 48.4 on the 3D versus 61.0. I got a 36.1 in Classroom on the X3D, and in the standard 7600, it got 48.4. So a fairly sizable, measurable difference.
NZXT's build is a quick and easy way to get a new gaming computer. Build a gaming PC on your budget using the built-in configurator and see exactly how your favorite games will perform. Don't want to spec it yourself? Then choose from BLD's pre-configured player PC systems designed to fit your needs and budget. To see the full lineup and specs of the NZXT BLD Player Series pre-built PCs, follow the sponsored link in the description below.
Now this is where going into the CPU or the GPU test, Phil and I both were like, oh man, how the heck is it gonna make up for this? Well, we tested Cyberpunk at both 1080p medium preset, no DLSS, no ray tracing, no frame gen, no shenanigans, just 1080p medium with a 4090. I know, we need to see if we bottleneck the CPU, what are the 2 different caps? What's the minimum FPS? What's the max FPS? What's the average? That will tell us how big our swings are. On the 7600, we got a minimum FPS of 78, a max FPS of 265, and an average FPS of 178. And I was like, beat that. And Phil was like, okay, how does a minimum of 72, a max of 290, and an average of 201 sound? Same GPU, same exact settings, but the Vcache. The Vcache is what made that major uplift. Once we go to 4K, it's a much different story because obviously 4K Ultra preset, same thing, no DLSS, no frame gen, no any of that. We take a lot of that alleviation off of the CPU and we put it onto the GPU to do a lot of scene processing. So the 5600X3D in 4K got a minimum of 64, a max of 110, and an average of 82.5. The 7600, a min of 68, a max of 111, and an average of 83.17. Really, really close, which makes perfect sense. Now let's go ahead and move into a little bit older title. This is Ryzen. Forza Horizon 5. All we're looking for here is the average FPS that's given you on the corner, and then the percentage of GPU limitation, because it will show you everything on there in terms of all the timing and stuff and FPS for both the CPU renderer, the simulation render, as well as the GPU. The 7600 and 1080p medium preset on Forza Horizon 5, 264 with a GPU bound of 0. If we look at the 5600X3D, however, it got 271 FPS average at, get this, GPU limitation of 1.7%. So what does that mean? It means the GPU started to become the limiting factor against that CPU at 1080p medium. I initially never planned on using a 4090 simply because of the fact that seemed completely ludicrous to put it on a CPU like this, but it shows the power of the Vcache and the fact that it can still be 1.7% waiting on the GPU to do its thing. So what happens when we go ahead and move that limitation now up to 4K Ultra? The 7600 is a 165 FPS average with a 25.1% GPU limitation. So that means 25% GPU bound. If we look over here at the 4K Ultra, 217 FPS with a limitation of 18.4. So what does that mean? It means we hadn't hit the engine cap, and there was plenty of more FPS on the table for the game to be allowed to render more. If we hit 200, 200, 200, 200, then we'd know like we hit the engine cap of the game. I think the engine cap in Forza is up in the 400s, to be honest. 18.4%, so less GPU limited on the older platform running the 3D V-Cache. Our last test here was Shadow of the Tomb Raider, just an older title that is guaranteed to be able to push the GPUs as far as they can go, and the CPU, but we love this title as well as the other ones we picked because it gives us a percentage of GPU, which shows us a bigger picture than just an FPS number. 5600X3D in Shadow of the Tomb Raider, 1080p medium with SMA enabled, no DLSS, no ray tracing, 309 FPS average, 0% GPU bound. 7600, 224, also 0% GPU bound. So there you go. There's a direct comparison, CPU to CPU, a difference of like 80 FPS between the two. But moving on to 4K now, this is on highest settings because again, we want to now take the load and put it back on the GPU. The 7600, 181 FPS average with a GPU limitation of 99, which makes sense because the GPU is now handling 4K highest settings, and that's a lot of load even for a 4090. Okay, with it being 99% at 181, I would expect that to be the case over the 5600X3D. However, that's not the case because it was 188 at 99%. So Phil and I were kind of joking like, yeah, was it 99.1 versus 99.9, 99.8, which can make up for that 9 FPS in there somewhere. But the point is, even in GPU bound situations, the 5600X3D is showing an uplift in performance when you do a bad pairing versus a 4090 and a 5600X3D. And it's a bad pairing with a 7600X as well. So a couple things to talk about now, whether or not which one is right for you. The AM4 platform is still dead-ended. I would be shocked if a new CPU came out for it. I'd also be shocked if these CPUs lasted more than a few weeks. Micro Center is expecting it to last a few months worth of inventory. Maybe not, based on how well these numbers are actually performing. The problem is the $229 price tag, because as I mentioned, if we take a look at other prices, as of Friday, 5600X non-3D 148. Obviously the 5600X would not perform anywhere near an X3D. I need to get one of those in hand so I can do an X3D and non-X3D comparison. 5700X 189, 5800X 209 or 208. So that 5800X though, I don't think it would be enough to uplift it above the 5600X 3D in gaming, but you definitely would gain a lot of productivity improvement because of the extra cores and the extra threads. Simultaneous multi-threading is a game changer when it comes to almost everything being multi-threaded these days. But what's the cheapest AM4 platform you could build? It would be a 5600X, and then with the 16 gigabytes of RAM at $30, and then averaging $109 to $149 for a B550 motherboard, depending on how beefy you want it to be built up. You could build an entire AM4 platform for $287, and that's only 50 bucks more, well, 60 bucks, not quite 60 bucks more than just the CPU cost of a 5600X3D. Remember, the 7600 is $219, which is only $10 cheaper, but you get forward compatibility, you have upgrade path when it comes to putting a newer CPU in there. Even next gen CPUs will still work with AM5, just how AM4 was supported from 2016 up until 2022. Technically 23 with this CPU. So you've got to ask yourself, are you willing to save money for the sake of a gaming CPU that came out 2 years after the last CPUs came out for that particular platform, the 5000 series CPUs? Or do you want to have forward compatibility? If you're trying to save as much money as possible, then you probably wouldn't buy an X3D CPU to begin with. Because unless you're putting a high-end GPU on it or something that's gonna actually be reaching the CPU's limitations, you're not gonna see the amount of spacing or gap between these two CPUs as we showed with the 4090, because you would never put a 4090 with a 5600 CPU, whether it's an X or an X3D or not. You'd probably end up putting something like a 3070 with it, somewhere around there, maybe a 6800 XT. You would definitely not see as much of a gap. But the other really compelling thing is apparently Micro Center has a bundle deal, which makes sense. If they're the only ones selling it, they can put together these bundle deals. For $329, that will get you the 5600X3D, a B550 motherboard, and 16 gigabytes of RAM. So what does that mean? It means the motherboard and the RAM are only gonna cost you $100 extra. That's a pretty compelling argument. Like I said, I would have loved to have compared this with more CPUs. I'm gonna get them in hand. I'm gonna do the testing. At the very least, to have the numbers myself. There's other reviewers that are probably doing a deeper dive with more CPUs. I honestly thought I had a 5800X and a 5700X, and apparently I don't. So where the heck they went, I don't know. I've got to find them. But my ultimate recommendation, although the performance is there, productivity-wise, it's pretty far behind a 7600. And productivity-wise, it would even be behind a 5600X non-3D because of the clock speed differences. So you gotta ask yourself again, do you wanna spend about an extra $150 or so total going with an AM5 platform and having future upgrade path, which I personally think would be worth it? Or do you want to buy kind of like the last hurrah of a dead-end platform? So that's the ultimate decision. Sound off down below what you guys would do even if you're not in the market of buying a CPU or motherboard or RAM or whatever. What would you do if you were? Would you go with the older platform and the newer CPU? That my biggest concern, honestly, is if they're such limited and you have one that fails or goes dead, will they even have RMA ability or not? So anyway, older platform or a little bit more expensive newer platform that has a future. All right, guys, thanks for watching. And as always, we'll see you in the next one.